What if you wrote one of the most iconic rock anthems of all time, and 23 different record labels told you it was worthless? They didn't just reject the song, they rejected you. They looked you in the eye and said your time was over before it had even begun. For most people, that's the end of the line. But for Joan Jett, it was just the beginning of how she built an empire from the ashes of rejection. This isn't just a rock and roll story. It's a story of survival, betrayal, and a mystery that has followed Joan Jett for her entire career. To her millions of fans, she's the shy genius, the leather-clad godmother of punk who fought the system and won. But to some of the women who stood beside her on stage, the story is much darker. They speak of a cold, controlling figure who turned her back on their shared past and buried its secrets. So which is it? Is she the hero or the villain? To find the truth, we have to go back to the very first time she was told no. It all started with a simple truth spoken to a 13-year-old girl who had just gotten her first guitar for Christmas. She walked into her first lesson, buzzing with excitement, only for the teacher to look at her and flatly state, "Girls can't play rock and roll." That one sentence could have ended her dream right there. But for Joan Marie Larkin, it was a declaration of war. She didn't listen. She just got louder. Soon after, she found her sanctuary at the epicenter of glam rock, a club called Rodney Bingenheimer's English Disco. It was here she shed her old identity, adopting the last name Jett and crafting her iconic look, the black shag haircut, the heavy eyeliner, and the black leather armor. She was modeling herself after Suzi Quatro, the trailblazing rocker who proved to Joan that a woman could front a band and own the stage. Quatro lit the spark, and Joan was determined to start a fire. And she found the dynamite. Through the notoriously eccentric producer Kim Fowley, Joan met drummer Sandy West. Together, they formed what would become the first major all-girl rock band, the Runaways. With Lita Ford on lead guitar, Jackie Fox on bass, and Sherry Curry as the lead singer, they were a teenage force of nature. Sherry Curry remembers being instantly intimidated by Joan, writing, "There had been something so shy and withdrawn about her, but man, when she put that guitar around her neck, you couldn't take your eyes off her. She oozed attitude and charisma." That day, Joan and Fowley co-wrote their explosive anthem, Cherry Bomb. They didn't want to be a novelty act. They wanted to be the female Rolling Stones. But the world wasn't ready. Sexist reviews ignored their music and focused on their looks. Rolling Stone absolutely hated them. But the hate from the press was nothing compared to the abuse they faced from audiences. Joan would later recall being drenched in spit by the end of every show, crying backstage, wondering why people hated them so much. But a much darker, private hell was unfolding behind the scenes. Kim Fowley wasn't a mentor, he was a predator. He pitted the teenage girls against each other, creating a toxic environment of jealousy and competition. He denied them proper schooling and healthcare, and according to them, kept them drugged and broke. He was a master manipulator, and he preyed on Joan's insecurities. Sherry Curry noted that Fowley would insert himself into Joan's songwriting process, not because he was needed, but because he wanted the royalties. She wrote, "Looking back, it was obvious that Joan didn't need Kim to help her write, but she was as young and insecure as the rest of us, and Kim really made us all feel that we needed him." This early experience with a manipulative puppet master was a brutal education. But the true horror of their situation, the event that would fracture the band beyond repair, would only come to light decades later. Bassist Jackie Fox revealed a deeply traumatic story, alleging that Fowley orchestrated a horrific incident where she was violated while incapacitated after a New Year's Eve show. The most explosive part of her claim was who she said was in the room watching: Joan Jett and Sherry Curry. The accusation was a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the rock community. Jett responded with a firm denial, stating on Facebook, "I was not aware of this incident." Obviously, Jackie's story is extremely upsetting, but for Jackie, the denial was another betrayal. She responded, "I only wish that if my bandmates can't remember what happened that night, they would stick to simply saying that." This wasn't a band falling apart over musical differences. It was a group of young women enduring unspeakable trauma. The band played its last show in 1978. The dream was dead, and the nightmare was just beginning. The collapse of the Runaways sent Joan into a tailspin. She confessed in her documentary, "I drank a lot, starting at 8 in the morning. She was angry, lost, and her heart was so broken, both emotionally and physically, that she was hospitalized with a serious heart infection. It was at this lowest point that a producer named Kenny Laguna entered her life. He saw a star when no one else did. He believed in her so fiercely that he was willing to fight the entire industry for her, becoming her manager, producer, and lifelong creative partner. But even with a powerful new ally, the industry had made up its mind. The bitterness from the Runaways era festered. Decades later, Lita Ford would publicly blame Joan for torpedoing any chance of a reunion, claiming Joan was trapped in Joan Jett land, a world tightly controlled by Laguna. Ford said, "Will she ever come out of Joan Jett land? I don't think so. We're just better off living our separate lives." But amidst all that animosity, Lita also told a story of a night in Japan when she was rushed to the hospital, hemorrhaging blood. When she woke up, Joan Jett was asleep in a chair next to her bed. Even in their war, a complicated bond remained. But that bond wouldn't be enough to get her a record deal. With Laguna's help, Joan recorded a solo album. When they brought it back to the United States, they were met with a wall of rejection. One by one, 23 different record labels turned them down. The message was clear. Punk was dead, and the world was done with Joan Jett. Out of options and out of money, they faced a choice: give up or go to war. Joan had the radical idea to do it themselves. Joan and Kenny took their life savings, reportedly Kenny's daughter's college fund, printed up the records themselves, and began selling them out of the trunk of Laguna's car after shows. This was the birth of Blackheart Records, an independent label born not out of a business plan, but out of pure, defiant necessity. It was a revolutionary act. A record exec with rumored mob ties eventually re-released her album, retitling it Bad Reputation. The title track was a middle finger to every critic and every executive who had slammed the door in her face. It was a comeback, but her real coronation was yet to come. While Joan was building her own kingdom, her former bandmates felt she was also rewriting history. Bassist Vicky Blue directed a documentary called Edge Play, an honest look at the Runaways' chaotic history. But the film has one glaring omission: the music. Joan Jett, the co-founder of the band and owner of an independent label built on artistic freedom, refused to license the rights to any of the Runaways songs. Vicky Blue was perplexed, saying the move was weird and perplexing to everybody. To her former bandmates, it felt like a calculated move to control the narrative, silencing a version of the story she didn't approve of. She had seized her own freedom, but was she now taking it away from them? For her next album, Joan formed a new band, the Blackhearts, and in 1981, they released I Love Rock and Roll. The title track was a cultural phenomenon. It shot to #1 and stayed there for 7 weeks. The timing was perfect. A new cable channel called MTV had just launched, and the video for I Love Rock and Roll was played in constant rotation. It beamed her iconic image directly into the living rooms of mainstream America, making her the first female rock star to truly conquer the new medium. Magazines that had once trashed the Runaways were now praising her. But even at the height of her fame, Joan remained a rebel. For her hit cover of Crimson and Clover, she made the quiet but radical decision to keep the original pronouns, singing, "I don't know her, but I think I could love her," sparking decades of speculation about her sexuality, a topic she has fiercely refused to discuss, adding to her untouchable allure. After the astronomical success of I Love Rock and Roll, her commercial fortunes began to cool. Her next albums failed to produce a major hit, and critics were dismissive. But while she may not have been topping the charts, her influence was quietly spreading. A new generation of female musicians who had grown up seeing her on MTV were forming their own bands. The Riot Grrrl movement of the 90s, with bands like Bikini Kill and L7, cited Joan Jett as their primary inspiration. They saw her not just as a rock star, but as the Godmother of Punk, a role model for female empowerment and artistic independence. And this is where the mystery of Joan Jett deepens. The story of the Runaways is one of trauma, conflict, and betrayal. But the story of Joan Jett and the Blackhearts is remarkably different. Former members describe her as a supportive, fair, and collaborative leader. Guitarist Ricky Byrd stressed that there were no hard feelings when he left, and bassist Gary Ryan said, "Joan and I were very close and got along very well. It was a stable, professional environment, the polar opposite of the Runaways. Did the trauma she endured teach her how to build a better, safer family with the Blackhearts? Or is this carefully constructed image part of the fortress she built around herself to protect her from the world and to protect her story from the world? The girl who was told no at her very first guitar lesson had become a rock and roll Hall of Famer. The industry that rejected her 23 times had no choice but to bow down. From a teenager being spat on to an artist building an empire from the trunk of a car, Joan Jett's story is the ultimate tale of revenge. But her greatest victory wasn't the fame or the money, it was control. By creating Blackheart Records, she seized control of her destiny, her music, and her image. She did it entirely on her own terms. Today, she remains an enigma, fiercely protective, letting her actions do the talking. She proved that a bad reputation is something you can wear like a crown, and that the best revenge isn't just selling records, it's building a legacy that can never be torn down.